Hello.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Hello.
welcome to the third of our TOK talks.
Yeah.
The topic today is, the prescribed title I should say, is there solid justification for regarding knowledge in the natural sciences more highly than knowledge in another area of knowledge? Discussed with references to the natural sciences and one other area of knowledge. Before we begin, I would like for each contestant, so to speak, to introduce themselves.
Hello, I'm Gregor, and I am an RA.
There we go. I'm Mr. Johnson. I'm the head of our TOK department.
I'm Mate, I'm a junior. I'm the only student.
The only one that counts. I'm Ms. Divya and I teach business and psychology.
And I am Mr. Henry.
There we are.
With that being said, we are on a timeline here. I believe that there are a lot of different things that we can consider when going into this question. But the first I think that is worth getting into is this idea of justification for regarding knowledge. So it is a outlook or an opinion, a way of thinking about knowledge that I think we should start from as a basis of this discussion. Right? This isn't a question necessarily of whether or not something is the case, but whether we should think of it in the following way, right? Is there solid justification for regarding knowledge in natural sciences more highly than knowledge in another area? Who wants to start us off?
I could kick us off. And thinking about justification, I think there is something almost paradoxical about this PT, because when we look at our different AOKs, one thing that we often think about first is the different methods of justification each area of knowledge has. So if we're looking for a solid justification of natural science being more highly respected or more highly regarded than other types of knowledge, well, it seems like we'll have to defer to a type of justification, and the natural scientist will predictably defer to his own method of justification, namely empirical verification or experimental confirmation. And I can imagine a representative from another area rightfully arguing that that would be unfair. Hey, Mr. or Mrs. Scientist, great, you can justify the use of science and how it impacts lives by referring to the scientific method and justifying your own argument through experimental confirmation, but that would be a bit too self-referential. There's something unfair in that game there. So I think starting off with justification, there is something that we need to make mention of, this diversity of methods of justification, and how we could possibly, in a neutral sense, answer this question without referring to our own AOK's method.
Yeah, I think just jumping on that, I definitely think that TOK teaches us that each area of knowledge has their own ways of knowing that are equally valid, and it would be remiss to try and undermine religious knowledge systems and their use of faith as a way of knowing by trying to I guess sort of make a comparison about the scientific method in natural sciences, because as we know on a sort of grand human scale, ways of knowing can impact on each other, they can come into different uses at different times, and so I think on the face of it this question looks like, okay, well, you have empiricism versus less tangible methods of knowing, but I think if you begin to scratch the surface on that, you realize that those are equally valid.
I agree with you, and according to empirical knowledge, scientific knowledge has a lot of evidence, while religion might be just invented or distorted by others to take advantage of the least educated classes. plus maintenance of a social hierarchy.
I'm also thinking about, in the natural sciences, for example, how do they build on the knowledge, or how do they create that knowledge? I would be more interested in how they pick out what they will investigate in research. And choosing an area that they will investigate and do research on really doesn't come so much from just the sciences, does it? It really has more to do with the intent and what is it that you choose to investigate. There's a whole lot of things that one can research on, but there's an interest that sort of drives investigation in a particular area. So I wouldn't be able to justify that natural sciences really dictates everything there is to know, and because, like you said, there's other ways, experience, faith experience itself, that can sort of be the same compass to finding out, and it determines what I find out. It will determine how I find out. So yeah, I'm not for I don't support the view that it's only natural sciences that, have the justification.
Yeah, and related to that, I can't help but think when I first saw this prescribed title, there's a famous quote from Freud that I always try to remember. That Freud said, "Everywhere I go, I find a poet has been there before me." And so here Freud was, a practicing psychologist and psychoanalyst and human scientist, let alone a philosopher. And he has this amazing thought that even though he's doing his scientific research, what his quote seems to be telling us is every time he arrives at a new conclusion, and Freud was great about revising his theory too. He arrived at something, but it was only provisional. But as he arrived at it, if we take his quote seriously, he's saying the essence of his idea was already discovered by the poet, perhaps centuries before. So I think there's something perhaps similar to what you're saying, Ms. Divya, that the reason for why a natural scientist goes into their strain of investigation could be much more in tune with what it means to be human, or what enriches their life, what provides meaning, which is often far removed from pure science. Those are almost sometimes taboo questions to ask in pure science. We're not after the meaning, we're after the data, we're after the numbers. So, yeah, there's something there. And I think also, earlier I made mention of the diversity of methods, how this question could be asked or answered unfairly. I think there's also a diversity of attitudes. And perhaps this is even more pronounced in the diversity of methods. If you think about a natural scientist again, what's unique about a natural scientist is they bring this natural attitude to the table. Everything needs to be naturalized. And if you don't have a natural attitude, if you don't subscribe to naturalism as a philosophical belief system, then the practicing scientists will say that's okay, if they're sufficiently tolerant to say that's okay, but you can't be doing science. This is not what you're doing. You're not conducting science. Let alone the diversity of methods, I think we're also forced to face the diversity of attitudes that we can bring to the table in thinking about all these different types of knowledge. I mean, it's perfectly common to have a non-natural attitude. Anyone who's had an inexplicable experience, let alone a mystical experience, but any other modes of experience that aren't at least immediately naturalizable, that lends itself to justifying one's experience in very different manners. Yeah. Unless someone else has something to say. I will say my background is in natural science, so I'm supposed to be the token, I think I'm the token guy in the panel today that's supposed to be carrying this torch of, yes, natural science is what we all need to bow down to. This is the A-OK to most highly respect. And that, I can relate to that. That's how I used to think when I was your age, Mate. That's what drew me into science. I thought it was the one A-OK to rule them all, Lord of the Rings style. And So if we kind of play devil's advocate, I no longer feel that way, I will admit now. But to play devil's advocate, why might that be? Why might that be perhaps even the common conception? I think this PT is saying is that this is often naively seen as, you know, the holy grail of what knowledge can be, the version of knowledge we see in natural science. And one thing, I think there are a couple ways where we can justify people feeling this. And one argument we might hear is that scientific knowledge, especially within the natural sciences, is generative of all other types of knowledge. So this kind of hierarchical attitude or foundational attitude where we kind of begin research scientifically, even if chronologically that's not the case, but in theory we start with science, and then if we want to enrich it and build upon it in various ways, then we can do human science, or we can do history. We can start thinking backwards about where the ideas came from. We can start thinking forwards and do amazing things, artistically speaking. But ultimately, people in this camp might say, that's all great, but at the end of the day, natural science seems to be generating the potential in all these other fields. So how do you guys feel about that?
I think on the face of it, that the reason people think that is because natural sciences and that scientific method again tends to offer a glimpse into rationality, and it's devoid of emotion. It's, you know, what is observable, it's sense perception, it's reason, it's, you know, experimentation, and then the conclusions you come out, you prove a theory, you prove a hypothesis, and then by, you know, formulating that proof, it's then out there, and other, you know, members of authority can, you know, come in and challenge that or revise it later. So I understand how, like, I guess taking it more broadly, looking at, instead of, you know, natural sciences, but the scientific method as a whole, you could argue that there is that sort of analytical, you know, judge the evidence for itself kind of aspect about it, which makes it, you know, which may be a justification for why that knowledge is weighty. But I think, coming back to what Ms. Divya said, is that the more I guess of a humanities or arts perspective you take to it, you begin to realize that actually I don't think natural sciences can be separated out from the social context that it developed in, and as an area of knowledge, the historical development over time has seen real shifts in the conceptions of what is empirical evidence. You know, like in Freud's time, you had eugenics and social Darwinism as an empirical, you know, system of fact. You could, through selective breeding, create you know, a better race of humans. You know, before that, in the 16th and 17th century, physicians and doctors believed that, you know, a man and a woman were sexual, like a woman was the sexual inversion of a man, and they descended from, you know, Galen's four humours, the one-sex model that women were colder and wetter and men were hotter and drier. And these things have all been disproved. And I think particularly the role of, you know, philosophy and the ideas that humans as a collective species have constantly created new laws in which they judge the world, you know, through myths, essentially. Like the concept of money is a myth that we have brought into the world and given it tangible constrictions. And I think that, more than anything, is the most telling of why natural sciences are subject to those same rules.
To make this
Coming-
issue,
Coming back to the quote, can you repeat it?
Freud's quote, yeah, he said, "Everywhere I go, I find a poet has been there before me."
Yeah, and according to that idea, I disagree with it because, like, in the field of physics, for example, like, new theories are being developed every day, and maybe they've been thought about but cancelled. But, like, for example, the theory of everything is, like, trying to be created right now, and nobody has thought of how to bond these physical realms.
if I could assert my role as as moderator, I think it's important for us to, especially for the viewer at home, to bring this down and make it concrete. If your partner or mother is dying of a disease, you will find value in a variety of different places. But that cure value, that thing that you desperately want more than anything else, we tend to associate as coming from natural sciences. If you have a conference in London on Saturday, getting in that plane and defying what many humans thought was just physically impossible for years is the result of natural sciences. And so beyond this notion of being in control or being the dominant force because of some deeper philosophical truth, I think we must grapple with the concrete ways in which science exerts its dominance, or I should say natural sciences exert their dominance in our lives, and the value by which we, with the special values, I think, that we may argue that we give them or we don't.
But I would think science, yes, like you said, definitely has a big role to play, and yes, we are very dependent on it. I think science goes as far as to explain or describe what is happening in the world of psychology. For example, if you're talking about a particular health condition, it can explain what is going on, it can describe what is going on, and therefore it gives you an avenue to probably look at the best intervention that's possible. But even in the world of psychology, for a particular health condition, for example, the symptoms keep changing. We have revised editions that are being published every year, and the kind of the shape of a particular condition could be different for different regions at different times. And so while it can, yes, going back to the example you used of, when a loved one is in a difficult position, yes, certainly we're looking to science for a cure, to do something about it as an intervention. But I'm not convinced that that's the only intervention we're really looking for. In that moment, I think as individuals, we're grasping for a lot more than just a cure for a condition that is physical. I think, going back to what Mr. Gregor was saying, there's also an emotional side, there's also a spiritual side. And I think sciences don't really address that. If you're looking at having to travel quickly to another place, yes, we are dependent on the sciences to provide a solution to get from point A to point B. But sciences don't really give us the explanation to what drives us to do that. And I think that comes from a different place altogether, beyond the natural sciences. There are things that us as individuals, the mind is grasping, is reaching out for something bigger than that, and things that are not as tangible. And I think that's the hunger that really drives natural sciences to define the scope of study and to broaden that scope.
Ms. Digby, I have a question for you.
Go for it.
Do you think psychology is an empirical science?
It can be, and I say this often in my class, because psychology will give you an explanation for what is going on. It will help you understand what is going on, but psychology will never give you the solution. You'll have to look outside. A lot of psychologists may not admit that openly, but they will. There is a lot of therapy that involves letting the client understand the need to look beyond what is available as resources and to look into faith to give you that support to rise above a certain challenge. And a lot of psychologists steer clear from, admitting that that is really where the solutions could come from, because it's not deemed as being scientific or objective enough. But really, a lot of scientists would agree that that's the only way forward. So I think natural sciences definitely provide us with avenues, equip us to understand, to be better, to do a lot of things. But does the natural science world actually answer all of our questions? I don't think so.
Yeah, I agree. I think you make a very good point about the role of knowledge in natural sciences and how much good it can do, and how, how revolutionary it has been on the way that we experience and interact with the world. But I would say to address the PT specifically, the question seems to be, maybe it's in its vagueness, maybe there needs to be some sort of qualification in the introduction, but it's regarding knowledge in natural sciences more highly than knowledge in another area. Okay, it's not, in some instances versus some other instances, it seems to be stamping, across the board. And so that is why I take, my stance, which is to, critique the question itself. But if I was to be, writing a TOK essay about this, I would begin with looking at the solid justification, like you have offered, for why we may regard it more highly. And then my conclusion would be, I think, what we have discussed here, which would be, actually, I disagree. Because I think the purposes that we find in life, on a more sort of creative, emotional, intuitive level, or the role of faith, and things like that, do not hold themselves to the natural scientific methods of knowledge.
Yeah, and if we interpret it universally, we insert in all ways. It seems to be implied there for sure. And to keep playing devil's advocate, besides this argument from generativity that natural sciences might be foundational, I can imagine another camp of people arguing that there's something about natural science that hits this sweet spot. So Mr. Henrik is saying that there is this down-to-earth component of natural science. When we're in a crisis, when we need a cure, natural science does swoop in for the rescue. So there's a pronounced practicality to it. As Mattei was saying, there's a pronounced theoretical nature to it. It actually tells us new possibilities. We're constantly creating the possible for us, more so perhaps than any other AOK. And then it's also universal. It gives us these laws, like Mr. Roach was saying, that are supposedly applicable in all domains and new contexts we find ourselves in. So it is kind of rare. This is different than saying it generates all other types of knowledge, but it does seem to be kind of rare in hitting that sweet spot of being both simultaneously theoretical, practical, and kind of poetic in some sense, and being universal to all. But if that's the case, back to Mr. Henrik's question, I wonder if it being the sole bearer of that honorific is more contingent upon the era we currently live in. And what I'm imagining is the future that we're headed to at an exponentially fast rate, where we don't have a clear distinction between, for example, humanity and nature. We don't have a clear distinction between humanity and the spaces we occupy. Everything is becoming more and more interactive. And so one field I want to throw out to you guys that I think, once again, as a previous physicist, I've moved on. I found a better way. But one thing in the not so distant future that might compete with natural science in this honorific of being the most highly regarded would be architecture. And I suggest this for the same reason. I think architecture might be an area of knowledge that, in the same manner of natural science, hits this sweet spot of really seriously thinking about possibilities. You can read all sorts of architectural theory that opens up these huge avenues of possibility of reimagining space itself. It has profound practical implications, how we actually move and navigate the world and interact with each other. There are buildings in Japan that the walls talk to you and they move in these libraries as you reorient your way of studying. And there are also places of congregation where we all come together and therefore kind of universally commune in artwork and production. So I think this secondary argument of natural science hitting the sweet spot, as opposed to being foundational of everything else, I can see someone saying, oh, it hits the sweet spot. It's got all the right pieces. That may well be true, but I suspect that it might be contingent upon the world we're in right now, and that could change in the not so distant future. So architecture I would throw out there for us to think about. And for other students, I might also throw in game design. I think there's something really special about, once again, in the not so distant future, designing games, especially games for us teachers that have pedagogical value. There's a supreme practical value to some games out there that also dive into theories of what it means to play and to play with each other. And many of them are filmic in nature now too, so they're artistic productions. So it's another type of knowledge that might be hitting the sweet spot. So in this sweet spot theory, do you think this holds any water? That's maybe why some people think natural science fits this bill?
It's interesting that you bring up architecture, because there's a lot of psychology that's going into design right now. There's a lot of interest in green architecture, in sort of changing patterns and the way spaces are created to be more conducive to certain environments that help you develop certain types of emotion and mindset, which is something that I think people valued and appreciated before, but now there's a lot more deliberate action in that area. And yes, there does seem to be more of an overlap between several areas of expertise, where you're bringing in the mathematical side, the design aspect, the social aspect, the economic aspect, and seeing how they all result in something that is beautiful but also is practical. And I suspect that exactly what you said, that mindset is going to flow into lots of other areas as well. Certainly the way we teach is now incorporating us a lot more than what I went through as a student, in terms of all the areas that we're dipping into for just one lesson experience. It's no longer confined to just one thing. Even if I'm teaching a particular subject, I'm always dipping into everything else, and students are bringing in anecdotes from their own experiences, from their own learning in other compartments that used to be distinctly, different and separate from everything else. But the lines are all blurred now, and I think that's a good thing, because of course it tells us that there's really, the comment that was made earlier, I'm not convinced anymore that there's a hierarchy of sciences. The lines are so blurred and we're using all of them together. The compartments are being broken very quickly, and rightly so, because when you look at your own experience, That's the best way to learn, that's the best way to know, and your experience itself is a combination of things. And that's, I think, the way forward.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think the question invokes a sort of 20th century, I guess, problem in human consciousness, in that we felt like we were the rational man who, lived and died by empiricism, and with the sort of traditional forms of developing technology over the course of that period, that tended to be held as quite an important thing. People did regard knowledge in natural sciences as potentially more highly. But now that, as you say, the nature of natural sciences start to become more interdisciplinary, those things might start to change. And it reminds me of something that came to me after your point, Mr. Henrik, about relying on natural sciences for a cure. And I think something that recently has begun to sort of ingrain itself in our cultural consciousness is the idea that that might not be the be-all and end-all. And I think that it carries with it some very Western-centric perspectives. And if you think about indigenous knowledge systems, and perhaps generations old herbal remedy or homeopathic cure that no one ever consciously created through following the scientific method and finding out its curative properties, but instead it passes down, maybe as a myth or as a tradition. And so I think to introduce a cultural relativist perspective into the way that we understand the natural sciences can again help us to open that up to more possibilities and find a sort of interdisciplinary approach to finding and uncovering knowledge.
Yeah, Mate, you earlier used the term that physicists like to toss around, a theory of everything. But now it seems like the theme that we're all collectively developing is we can zoom out and criticize this PT by criticizing the very artificiality of the boundaries between AOKs and seeing things become increasingly interdisciplinary. And so if that is the trend in the way that we're moving, perhaps the physicist theory of everything will become like a genuine theory of everything, which really does truly include all other types of knowledge. It's always quite arrogant of the physicists to say theory of everything if you think about it. But maybe we could focus on that. Once again, playing devil's advocate, is we're all kind of assimilating to this other view, but is there anything that gives the physicists the right to claim that, okay, we definitely don't have one yet, but to make this bombastic claim that they're after a theory of everything? What gives them the right to even say that? Do you think there's a justification for being after everything? I mean, I think if we can find an answer to that, I think that does give us insight into this PT, because once again, on this universal level, maybe that's why we have respect and it gets this stamp of approval of being the one AOK to rule them all. If it's the only AOK that claims to be after a theory of everything, but what do they even mean by that? I mean, once again, it's the cosmos, naturality, the natural world. Okay, that's the scope that they can expand into. But with everything we've discussed, that's really not everything. There's all other modes of experience that the other areas are about.
One of the examples that makes me think of is like how at a sort of, at their most like theoretical and advanced level,
Yeah.
the overlap between maths and philosophy. And so like the idea of like quantum physics
Yeah.
and how that can determine whether or not like we have free will. I think that is something that, I mean, way beyond my understanding as a historian. But I remember we had a talk once where the example of like the firing atoms through the gold sheet, and they react differently when they're observed versus when they're not observed. And that is like a bending of the laws of physics as we understand them. But it's an observed event that makes us question, the existence of free will or whether predetermination is a thing. And so I think that seems like an interesting avenue to consider.
Yeah. I like that you brought up mathematics too, because I think that may well be the one AOK that we've yet to touch upon in particular, which is surprising because it's the one I'm obsessed with. But yeah, I think that some of that goes back to that first argument I was suggesting of generativity and this hierarchical foundational framework. Because I would be inclined to say the card-carrying natural scientist who gives this foundational or hierarchical argument, I think my first counter-argument would be say, that's great, but look above you in your so-called hierarchy and you'll find mathematics. It seems like, especially the hardest of the sciences, once again, in the case of physics, physics is nothing. There's no everything, there's nothing. It's a theory of nothing without mathematics. So in that respect, I think, if we, for the sake of argument, play their game and go back to this, I think we all know this is an outdated picture now, but if we go back to this outdated picture, mathematics seems to me quite compelling answer for why we ought to respect the professional mathematician the most. And it's quite, if you don't mind me just riffing on this 1 second, if we think about, and I tell my students this sometimes, if you think about what a professional mathematician does, it's quite wild. It's quite a different type of lifestyle than any of us could ever imagine, because they literally sit often in isolation and solitude, obsessed about one particular problem for decades at a time. And maybe if they're remembered, they eventually come upon that solution on some random day during a walk where they just talked with their wife and then they tripped over a stick and they said, oh yes, okay, and then they scribbled the equation on a bridge in Scotland, and now we all remember it in the history books. But it's like this really strange brand of moral courage to dedicate yourself to such a strange lifestyle. But in this outdated picture, it seems like we should be respecting them the most, this otherwise strange behavior. And I think the reason why if we subscribe to this picture of a hierarchy of AOKs, I think the reason why natural science might get the stamp of approval instead of mathematics might often be this kind of, back to this timeline thing. Like, how quickly will natural science impact society and our lives? Well, it seems like that will happen, on average, much more quickly than the impact we see from pure mathematics. Because I think it's a bad argument to try to say that mathematics doesn't impact society on the level we've been talking about in the same way natural science does. I think it does infinitely more so. And is often not even cataloged historically, because it's so hard to trace the trajectory. How did this random idea that occurred in Italy in the 14th century end up being part of quantum mechanics and physics, which now is part of our computers, which is now dictate the algorithms that Mark Zuckerberg uses, which therefore then controls our social interactions. So it's an impossibly difficult trajectory to trace. But if we play this game of a hierarchy, I'm telling you guys right now, I would pray to the altar of the mathematicians much more so than the natural scientists.
And to give us a moment to reflect on this, unfortunately, one among us has to go seek nourishment. So if we can give a round of applause to participation.
You got me going on mathematics.
Yeah.
And
Well, I was just going to say after that, like,
Yeah.
it makes me think about that whole thing is like you talking about maths
Yeah.
and like why we have a hierarchy of areas of knowledge.
Yeah.
Like natural sciences, again, seems to be the one that we just collectively decided was the most relevant over the past, whatever, 150, 10 years.
Yeah.
And I think if everyone collectively decided and agreed that there was no one better area of knowledge, and that all of them informed each other in some way and contributed to the way we now perceive our lives, then we might not be having, this question might not even exist in the first place. There might not even need to be like a prescribed title that frames one as this is the general accepted narrative and let's challenge that. But instead, people would think that other areas of knowledge are all affecting each other equally.
Right. Or even if strangely IB decided to make this prescribed title, very related to what you're saying is we wouldn't even be able to make sense of it.
Yeah.
Like why?
Yeah.
Where would this high regard even be coming from? Yeah. Yeah.
One thing that I was thinking of related to this that could potentially be a grounds for a little bit more conversation is this example you gave of the mathematician laboring in lonely isolation. Doesn't that in itself explain why mathematics is not vaulted or seen as in such high regard, right? We have Richard Feynmans of the world who go out and through their scientific knowledge seem to directly, concretely impact the world. Their research is done in often collaborative ways, if not exclusively collaborative in many different disciplines. And then they are sort of trotted out and forced to make themselves important to their institutions, right? If a scientist, if a department is not contributing, the institution will be looking,
Yeah. I think, I'm inclined to reply to that just with kind of go-to counterexamples. Like Paul Dirac, back to quantum mechanics and physics, he's often not known as much when you guys, especially at the high school and intro college level, study physics. But I would argue for quantum physics, he's the most important mind for that theory. He really crystallized the theory and gave it the shape and literally the notation that we use to this day. But as a human, as a character, he was highly, highly introverted. He barely spoke to anyone, including his own family members, and he was just a very kind of distant person. And yet he contributed immensely to a natural scientific field. And then conversely, in terms of mathematicians, I painted that picture of the man or woman in isolation, but I can think of a contemporary mathematician by the name of John Baez. He's still alive, works in California, and he is the most socially networking human I know of on the planet. What he does besides producing mathematics on a daily basis is he's constantly connecting minds to each other and saying, hey, you should read this. Hey, this sounds like what that guy said. Hey, and that's like what he does. He's one of the most communal people I've ever experienced. And so I don't think that's necessarily intrinsic to the disciplines. And perhaps I overemphasize that. I think that's just kind of like the standard. I think that goes hand in hand with the obsessive character of finding a mathematical problem. And humans don't always share in the same pet obsession. So I think that plays into that a little bit too. But Mr. Rich, you also mentioned philosophy earlier, and I would be remiss, and both of us would be remiss in not talking about philosophy and back to the sweet spot argument. I think there's something there too, especially like when mathematics touches upon philosophy, because I think there's another instance of pure theory touching upon the practical. If we think about ethics and philosophy, that's the way we should live our lives. And then if we think about coming up with universal laws, like in metaphysics, I think there's another sweet spot where we have a type of knowledge which is really entangled with all these different modes of experience. So I think by the same token, if natural science will get that honorific, certain types of ethical knowledge and philosophical knowledge probably ought to receive it as well. Yeah. Any questions from our large audience? Tosin?
I have a question. I feel like you answered the question. I think you said what right do they have? What right does natural science have to say that there is a theory for everything? Do you want to double down on that? Like talk more about what right they have?
I'd love to.
That's the answer to the question. If you can.
Yeah. Matej, you brought it up. Do you have anything more to say about that?
Well, basically what it is, it's combining like cosmic level physics with like really small microphysics. So I don't have an idea of why they would call it the theory of everything. Do you have any idea?
Since my background's in physics, I try to sympathize with these guys once in a while, and honestly, the history of physics is often a history of absurd arrogance, because there's, Maxwell, the famous physicist behind electromagnetism, once said, we're done with physics. All that's left is carrying out the calculations to further decimal places. And so that's like the height of arrogance. And theory of everything is also, I think after today's discussion, I think we can at least walk away knowing that there's something somewhat arrogant about this. Like, what gives them the right to use capital E everything? And what I would be inclined to say is, I think the physicists, they bring to the table a natural attitude. And in order to do physics, they say, we're only engaging with the natural world, and we subscribe to naturalism. And if the entire scope of the natural world is the cosmos, is the universe as we know it, and plus, they have some humility. They do admit things about dark matter, and Hawking says there's no boundary to the universe, and there's multiverse theories, and there's the expanding universe, and light only travels so fast, so we can't see beyond the observable horizon. So there are all these moments of humility and modesty, but that's like built-in modesty to the science itself. It's not the modesty from the people behind it. And so I think that's what they're forced to say, that the theory of everything has an asterisk. There's a star after everything. And if you read the footnote associated with that asterisk, the good footnote should say, what we mean by everything is everything in the natural world insofar as we can observe it.
I think one way of potentially making this metaphorical, right?
Yeah.
Is the idea that if you think of the universe as being constructed like a Lego design, right?
Yeah.
It has these base components.
Yeah.
And what physicists are saying is, because I understand these base components, and because everything that exists in this Lego land is made of Legos, and I understand how these Legos combine and the rules for how you can combine Legos. And sure, you may have creative things like architecture, and sure, you may have this soft science of people's emotions. But what I can do is I can open up the brain from whence those emotions come and say, these are the Legos and how they're interacting in order to create this emotion.
Yeah. And if you don't mind me interrupting, I think that goes full circle to where we started today, and I think the unfairness of this prescribed title. Because if we're going to look for solid justification, then we need a method of justification. And every AOK has its preferred method of justification. And so we all know the natural scientist will defer to his or her own method, and you just described it perfectly, Mr. Henrik. Like there's a long heritage of reductionism, so-called reductionism, in the natural sciences. Thankfully, even within physics, that's starting to deteriorate a little bit thanks to quantum mechanics. But nonetheless, there's this reductionism. Everything's built up from Lego pieces. And now we can see clearly this foundational hierarchical arrangement of AOKs. We can see how they're using the reductionism of their own area, and they're applying it to the structure of all areas. They take a reductionistic attitude to all of the areas themselves, and they say, oh, okay, yeah, you guys are doing other stuff. You're doing artsy things and you're doing historical things. But we're the Lego, what's the standard Lego brick, 2x6 or whatever? Like we're the 2x6. And sorry, you guys got to use our pieces. You can make a beautiful cathedral, but you got to use our molecules. And so I think that highlights the unfairness very clearly. They're using their own reductionism to try to answer this question, which I think would be unfair.
To perhaps overstep my moderator role,
No.
but I think this is a useful thing. There may be a one-way relationship here, right? A reductionist physicist can say, I can describe your psychological situation through the use of Legos, but some would say your psychological explanation will not be able to describe what I do, right? The explanatory power goes in one direction, right? Architecture, I can explain why you're able to build these buildings. Your theory, your field of knowledge, your area of knowledge, can't and has no explanatory value going in my direction. So there seems to be, perhaps, from that Lego constructor's point of view, I give you the tools. I have the ability to describe everything you're doing within my area of knowledge. However, your areas of knowledge can't do that inversely.
My counter to that would be, and this is something I remember from a chemistry class when I was taking the IB, and my chemistry teacher said to me, we were looking at, I can't remember exactly, organic chemistry, and she said that no one actually knows what those Lego bricks, as it were, look like. We don't know what the atomic makeup of cells and everything that makes up the world really are, because we can't see them. We've placed our own best idea, our best guess, based on the maths and all the, again, empirical observation that we can do, to think that, okay, so we think that this is what a carbon, CO2 molecule looks like, right, whatever, and the way we draw them out.
Yeah.
It's just a guess.
Yeah.
And so I suppose the philosopher would say to the physicist or the chemist or whoever is trying to say that, this one-way system is that, well, you are only able to dictate why you think the Lego blocks look like they do because you are part of a human race that has consciousness and gets to wonder about the big things like what makes us up. And that, essentially is a condition of, us having wonder and curiosity and things like that.
Yeah. I can't help but remember, this goes back to game design too, as another area I pitched out as maybe hitting the sweet spot, but there's this lovely event where practicing geneticists biologists, not quite as small of a scale as molecular, but on a slightly larger scale of the three-dimensional structure of complex proteins, which have this amazing origami-like folding, which we can never probe. Once again, we can't, science itself doesn't quite know literally what it looks like, but we know they have these complex origami-like foldings, and talk about societal impact and the cures for diseases. I mean, this is a massive industry. And so there's this lovely episode in scientific history not too long ago where the geneticists and the biologists had tried for years and years and years to find out the three-dimensional shape of these biomolecules, macromolecules, and they all but had given up, and then they pitched the problem in the form of a video game to children, to the youth. And we all know the end of this story. Within a week, the gaming world had solved the structure. And so what knowledge were they using? Well, luckily the rules, the folding rules of macromolecules, was built into the game, so they didn't really have to learn that. Well, they learned it, but immediately. the knowledge they were using was this interfacing knowledge. How does a hand operate a controller? How do you engage with a screen? How do you manipulate something on a two-dimensional surface that's ultimately three-dimensional? And so they used their gaming knowledge to solve this decades-long unsolved problem in 3D protein structure within a week. And how much money did they earn? I think close to nothing. It was just kind of celebrated in one article that's long forgotten. But I think it speaks to what you're saying. Like we often don't know these things literally, and even more so, it might be these other AOKs that feed into pure natural science in terms of really giving it that impact.
And with this
yeah.
statement of long forgotten and yet still consequential things, hopefully this discussion will not be. I think it was a wonderful discussion. It covered a lot of ground, and
Yeah.
I think at this point, because we're running on time,
Sounds good.
sounds good.
All right.
I would like to thank everyone here in the audience, and a round of applause for all the participants. And tune in next week.